Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a YouTube podcast produced by Keat TV. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Over the last year and a half, I've had the opportunity to interview dozens of brilliant, forward-thinking people, all of whom have come to believe that there is something wrong with how we as a species conceive of the universe and our own place within it. This centers around the UAP topic and related high strangeness sort of subject matter. For today's conversation, I wanted to reach back to two of these folks, two of the brightest lights, so to speak, and stop for a moment of consideration. What have I learned over these past 18 months? Where is it all heading? Do we know? Can we know? Can we even affect the trajectory of what's coming in any realistic way, or are we merely along for the ride? Author and Professor James Madden and experiencer Matthew Roberts, also an author, will join us to review some of what we've discussed over these past months and help us to perhaps decode where all the disparate signals may be pointing. These guys are absolutely brilliant thinkers, as most of you know, and I'm honored to have them on the show once again. To me, one thing seems increasingly clear. This phenomenon is concerned with how we think. It seems to be making a concerted and organized effort to force a change in the way we grok the universe and thereby demonstrate the power of mind in shaping reality. I could be wrong. I'm not a direct experiencer myself, but this is where I feel like a lot of the currents seem to be pulling us. Am I onto something, or am I full of shit, like so many others who claim to understand what's really going on with the UAP phenomenon? The resolution may well be televised, at least on Keat TV. So if you guys don't mind, can you guys just give a little brief introduction of yourselves and talk a little bit about how you came into the topic and why you find it so entrancing, I guess, or so fascinating? James, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, my way into it is far less interesting than Matthew's. So, as you know, as I always note, I'm a guy who is having just a fairly normal, conventional, academic career. I'm a professor of philosophy at a small liberal arts college in the middle of the United States. I've done work in philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion, metaphysics, that sort of thing. I've taught all sorts of stuff because I teach at a small school, and I was really not interested in any active way in the UAP phenomenon until like so many other people out there, until the 2017 New York Times article that struck me. Wow, and then you've heard me tell the story before, James, but it was in 2021. I was literally watching I was going through the X-Files TV series with my teenage kids, okay, because we assure that they experience the finer things in their education. And
That's right.
I remember we got to the end of season one, and that was that first big Pentagon briefing, where it seemed that the Pentagon at least was not denying that something like this goes on, and that very much intrigued me. And then, like I deal with everything in my life, I read. Okay, so I started reading a lot of the kind of the classic ufology literature, and I was actually impressed by what I found there. I think it exceeded my expectations. When I found people like Valet, I found people like John Keel, that I thought these were serious, interesting intellectuals. And then I happened upon Diana Pasulka's American Cosmic, and got in touch with her. Diana's work was very helpful to me because she's an academic and she was publishing with Oxford University Press. It sort of gave permission for people in my world to do this in a way, so that's very important.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then next thing I know, and I'm seeing it dovetail very interestingly with the work I'm doing in philosophy of mind, cognitive science. I'm writing a book on that independently of this issue at the same time in my life. And I would have never guessed that when I got to this point in my career that the UFO phenomenon would be one of the central focuses of my thought, but here I am.
And you recently published a book, Unidentified Flying Hyperobject, which is a fantastic book and helps to sort of frame the way I think that we can try and absorb this whole subject and related subject matter into our ways of thinking without a lot of the trauma that seems to accompany thinking about it for folks who are on the materialistic path, I guess. Matthew, if you could tell us a little bit about your own experience. Obviously, you have a book also, Initiated, which outlines that journey, and it's an amazing read. I love that book, and I mean, I get chills even thinking about it. So, can you explain to us, as as well as you can, the overview of how you ended up where we are today?
Yeah, so I was working as a cryptologist in the Navy for 16 years. towards the end of that career, I was on the USS Roosevelt for the Gimbal incident in 2015. And then after that, I transferred to the Office of Naval Intelligence, where I did my final tour, final 3 years in the Navy. And of course, while I was working at ONI, that's where the events took place that I lay out and documented in my book Initiated. And I will say that, you know, I am I get how people are very much against woo. I was very much against woo. And so I don't try to sell any of this as woo, right? I kind of approach it from the same point that I think Dr. Madden does in terms of thought processes, in terms of philosophy. I love philosophy these days. And philosophy was not something that I ever read before. I had zero interest in it. But now, post my experiences, I can read philosophy and see how it makes sense and how it's still very much relevant. And that's why in the Encounters docuseries, I actually state that, the answers to this are not going to lie in the material sciences. They're going to lie in the humanities and philosophy, religious studies. That's where we're going to find the answers to this stuff. So, um, and it's not woo. And I'll just leave it at that.
Well, the problem with woo is it's in the eye of the beholder, right? So
Right.
what's one man's woo is another man's whoa.
Yeah,
I guess
right.
is probably the best way to put it.
Mhm.
One thing just occurred to me real quick. The experiences in the book happened when you were with the Office of Naval Intelligence. Do you think that your being in the Office of Naval Intelligence provoked those experiences? Are there other people within ONI who are right now having those experiences because it's something that might commonly happen to people in that office?
Um, I will say that I'm not the only one
Mm.
who had these experiences, but I will say that I was the only one who was brave enough to leave and say enough, enough with the secrecy. The American people, the world has the right to know that this stuff is real, that it's happening, um, and to just pay attention. And so I mean I don't fault those people for that, or anyone in the military for that, because you gotta look out for yourself and keep an eye on your pension and stuff like that. But it wasn't something that I felt I needed. So I had the luxury of just quitting and going public.
Would you say there's an effort ongoing to give people in that office or the military these experiences by something other than, I mean, these questions sound so outlandish, but that's like really the heart of what a lot of us are wanting to know about. Like, is there an effort on the part of this intelligence to communicate with people in government? And is that happening way more than we're aware?
Yes, I think so. I think that my feeling is that it touches people in key positions, right? And whether or not you understand what it's putting down in front of you, I think is a whole other issue. But it's definitely happening. Yeah.
Okay, that's huge. So we can stop now and go home, and I'll put that on Twitter and have a field day. Thank you for sharing all this stuff, your
Mhm.
experience and all of it, and any of the insights that you've gained, which were hard earned. I encourage people to read your book, and I'll have a link in the description. It's interesting to me that you're the only one here who's had a direct experience, but the reaction from all three of us was the same, which is you get introduced to the topic and you do a little bit of research, whether that's actually in your bedroom or, through the internet or whatever else, and you turn to books and you
Mhm.
begin this deep dive that for me at least, and I think I could say the same thing for you, is that it leads to like a radical transformation of your personality over time. I mean, and I don't know why that necessarily is, but it changes the way that we view the world. And so part of what I've been trying to wrestle with is like, my whole approach is to say it's happening, so let's talk about it as if it's happening rather than trying to get beyond the, is it true? Can we prove it? Or any of that stuff? Because I feel like that's an endless conversation and an endless argument we can have. But it seems to be transforming people and it makes them think differently. And to me, that seems like one of the biggest takeaways that we can see, whether or not we can get motive out of that. Um, but can you talk a little bit about how it changed your way of thinking? Like before this happened, you were, Matthew, and you had a life and a way of thinking, and then this happened, and then as you outline in the book, I mean, Plato and Jung and all these things sort of internalized, and you became a much more effective thinker. And can you talk a little bit about that, and then we'll hit James up for some
Yeah,
points.
sure. So, when this did happen to me, it was transformative in that something that I talk a lot about is positive personality disintegration. And that's just the ability to integrate trauma into your own psyche.
Yeah.
And the way in which you do that is to kind of accept what's being laid before you and say, okay, so what does this mean now in through the lens of the rest of my life and my outlook on the world? And so in terms of being exposed to these things, you almost have no option but to change, because the phenomenon will expose you to things that you thought were impossible. And you can either deny that and continue to deny it, or you can just accept it and go with it. And I just accepted it and I went with it at face value. Um, and I did that because in my own mind, I kind of, there are all these theories out there floating around about what this is, and is it good? Is it evil? What does that mean? But I kind of reserved judgment until I had a better understanding of what was going on. Because clearly what was happening to me was so profound and just out of the norm that I really just had to do that. I had to take a step back from myself and kind of analyze, okay, what is going on here and what does it mean to me and what does it mean going forward? And so it totally just transforms your worldview. And one of those things is, and it sounds crazy, but this idea that there is no such thing as death, right? And this, my opinions on this are pretty well informed. There's studies that have been done at the University of Virginia that kind of point in that direction. There are other things like Homo naledi, Homo naledi is what they're called.
Naledi, yeah.
Yeah, they're not even human, and yet they were burying their dead in caves with grave goods, things that they could take with them, right, after death. And they were doing this 200,000 years before Homo sapiens were doing it. And so what does that mean, right? That everybody and even non-human intelligences that predate humanity were doing this. Is it that we're all just looking for some kind of excuse, some kind of something beyond, or is there actually something beyond? And that's I mean, that's pretty heavy stuff when you are faced with that in your life. And so it does transform things. And I accepted that. But I was never a religious person. I was never a spiritual person. I never believed in any of that until I experienced it. And so I don't fault people for not believing in it if they haven't experienced it. That's why, I don't push my book too hard. My book is really, I wrote it for people who were having experiences rather than as a book to try and convince people of something,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, because for so many people, I think that this whole notion is so unsettling that when they
Yep.
encounter this kind of information, it's like their guard goes up and they immediately say, well, this person's either crazy or
Hmm.
having, some sort of hallucination. They're not willing to even entertain the notion that this reality could function in that way, which is kind of, it seems like the nut of where the phenomenon may be pushing the species is to re-engage with that question. James, if you don't mind me asking you about that, like, um, for people who are outside of philosophy or academia in general, it seems like so many of these questions are settled. Like the materialist paradigm in our culture and across the world seems like it's in force, and there's no serious questioning of it because to do so is to be wrong. In the face of all the experts and science and all the capital letters that we can think of in terms of like authority, and so people don't want to necessarily engage in those questions because they think that they've long been answered. Can you talk about philosophy so that people maybe get a sense that it's actually supposed to be like working? It's evolving. It never gets somewhere. It's a constant question and a process that should be able to go back and review the fundamental primordial issues and still advance in some sort of way. Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you talk a little bit about why people should feel empowered to engage with those kinds of questions?
Yeah, just think of it from the standpoint of academic philosophy, philosophy in universities. Um, Philosophy is a weird discipline compared to a lot of other disciplines in that, I mean, I think on the whole, like any other academic discipline in the contemporary university, you're dealing with mostly secular people, but there's some, survey evidence to show that among the disciplines, especially in the humanities, philosophy is actually the least secular. Okay, like so you can be, very open about not being a materialist in most sort of elite philosophy departments. Okay, I mean, like like the hard problem of consciousness is taken very seriously in philosophy. And some of the leading people, like David Chalmers and other people you may have heard of, are openly not materialists. Okay, doesn't mean they're religious. Okay, but they're willing to say it looks like this materialist paradigm is not really closing the loop on some of these issues. Okay,
Mhm.
and find that among some ethicists, they'll say, look, we just don't think we have a very good account of what ethical truths would be without like invoking something beyond what we can fit into a reductive materialism.
Mhm.
So, and then you have, entire subdisciplines of philosophy, like philosophy of religion, that are like looking at the rationality of religious belief. And even if you're not a believer, if you're going to make your life considering that issue, you must think there's something to the other side of it at some level, right? That it's worth looking into.
Yeah.
So I think just academic philosophy in general, I think is much more open. It attracts weirdos like me in a way that other disciplines may not. Okay. Now that being said, it's interesting though, something like the UFO phenomenon would have been beyond the pale. Okay.
Yeah.
It completely. And so the way I put it is, people like Matthew, even though I'm not a materialist, I wasn't a materialist independently of this issue. Okay. Um, but people like Matthew, and David Fravor, Alex Dietrich, these military people who've had these experiences that moved the woo meter for me, right? It moved it back, stuff that I dogmatically, unreflectively, even though I'm a professional philosopher, would not have taken terribly seriously. It's moved the needle, and I think what we're seeing here is because of the openness that we're seeing from very, very serious people, very people in positions to know these things. I think what's counting as common sense is on the move now. Okay. So anytime somebody proposes that something anomalous or unexpected has happened, we have to sort of, compare the probability that they're wrong or lying or something against, or the probability of their reliability against the improbability of the event. And it can be something so improbable, right? Or that there's no really good testimony for it, so you would never actually believe it. But now you have these people like Matthew, right? Professionals in these fields who at peril to their professions, right? It's not a good way to advance your career in the Navy by saying, you've seen a flying saucer, right? Now that they're coming out, it's moving what I think the background probabilities are, right? So that, like, we have to say it, the common sense less and less just rules this out. And I think now our very basic common sense beliefs are up for grabs in a way that they never have been before, or at least not in like recent memory.
Yeah.
And
You know
so I
what?
think
Go
a
ahead,
lot of
please.
room for there's a lot of room for popular philosophizing in a way that there hasn't been in a long time.
Yeah. One of the things that I think that you talked about it in On Thinking, which I didn't give the treatment that I gave Unidentified Flying Object yet. I want to actually have it on the show just to talk about that book. But there was a notion in there about, the idea of progress in thinking, and that like we are going to some final point that is like, it's a steady climb and advance. But that's kind of an illusion, right? I mean, like we are, it's like different times call for different modes of analysis and different ways of conceiving of the world. And that notion of because we're later and because we've done more thinking, somehow we don't have to second guess ourselves ever seems like endemic and across science and a lot of other professions. And what the phenomenon is asking us to do is to be way more humble in our conception of our own achievements. Do you see that as well, or am I just,
Yeah,
puff and smoke?
100%. I mean, the way I'll put it is if indeed our thinking gets a grip on the world, then we have to admit that the world gets a decisive vote in how this is going to go. And it could be that there are things that we thought are settled that aren't settled. And I think this is the very sign of rationality is that we admit that we could be wrong and we're really ready to correct. Okay. And once again, I think what's happening with the phenomenon now is a lot of things that we thought we had right, we're becoming clearly clueless about. Okay. And a lot of things that we thought, were beyond the pale of belief and we're woo and things like that are in fact sort of asserting themselves now. So I think it's exciting times, okay, in
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
good and ill. But the good side is that there is this possibility of being surprised by the world again, which is, I think, exactly what we need.
Yeah, no, and that big the reenchantment of the world in a way. It's like we reestablish that there's mystery possible, and suddenly, I mean, for me, it was like there was an unfurling of the soul. Like I'm slightly exaggerating here, but it's like, I mean, from I felt like there were things going on in the world, and it became revealed to me through the study of this topic that I had no idea of. And then suddenly, I felt like once again, it's a place worthy of my own awe, And for a long time, when you operate in the world that everyone else is operating in, it seems so explained and tired and cliched in a lot of ways. And I think that one of the ways that this phenomenon is changing us, breaking us, or whatever, is to, like Cripple says, and re-enchant us and give us a sense that we're, part of something much bigger and much more mysterious. Matthew, like you mentioned earlier, Jungian symbols and that his ideas and Plato and how did I mean the phenomenon even went, I think, as far as to give you names of people to look at and to study, which is fascinating. Can you give us a sort of summary of what you think it's trying to push you toward in terms of your conception of what's real?
Yeah, I think that it's really just trying to push us to push ourselves, really to push the boundaries of what we perceive to be real. Because obviously they have a much larger perception of what is real than we do. Um, and in terms of Jungian psychology, I mean, he is just right on. I mean, it was uncanny, really, to be able to post my experiences. I I had this like the only thing I can describe it as is like enlightenment, right? And so my immediate reaction to that was, what is it? What am I actually seeing here? What am I actually perceiving? Um, because I could see that I could see that the whole world and everyone in it was chasing um symbols of what I had just been through, right? Like everyone was chasing the symbolic representation of that in the physical world. They're chasing money, they're chasing wealth, they're chasing power, all of these things. And they're chasing the wrong thing, right? Rather than chasing the real thing, that underlies those symbols. And that was what was most apparent to me right off the bat. And so when I started to read Jungian psychology, and it talks about archetypes, and you can just think of archetypes as psychological lines of development.
Mm-hmm.
And so I could see everyone in the world was just chasing the symbolism of these psychological lines of development rather than developing themselves psychologically. So in other words, you can either you're going to do something with these archetypes, with these psychological lines of development, and you will either project them or you will become and embody them. And if you're projecting them, it becomes very dangerous because these lines of psychological development that lie in the subconscious, they are constantly pushing us, and they seek to destroy that which does not resemble itself, right? And so if you're projecting it, you're also projecting that destruction, right? And this gives birth to this kind of malignant narcissism within the psyche where I need to destroy you because you're different than me, right? Rather than taking this on board psychologically. It was really like just looking through a mirror and everything is in reverse. It was a very strange experience. And like I said in the book, it would stop me in my tracks several times a day, and I would just be like, "What is that? What am I seeing here?" Um, and it was just incredible. And one of the so and this is another thing. I I was never a believer of woo, as I said earlier, but as things progressed, I would wake up in the morning. I would have questions, throughout the day about what I was seeing. And then as I'd go to bed that night with these questions, and then I would wake up and this female voice would give me a name or something like that. And I would look that up and Google it and see, oh yeah, this is a real thing. And as I'm waking up from sleep, I'm hearing this person's name that I've never been exposed to before. So that was, and it would just happen to have everything to do with the questions that I had running through my head. And I would read these people's books and it would just blow me away. All my questions answered. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
Diana Pasulka talks about this kind of thing. She talks about how there are people working within aerospace that have this consciousness connection where they can just pull knowledge out of the air, basically, and they do very well with it. Uh,
It's
so
some of the most advanced thinking on Earth is happening with people who are convinced they're talking to other intelligences, which is
yeah.
really one of the fundamental facts that just blew my mind and meant that I had to follow this topic. I was like, yeah, it's absolutely startling and crazy to think about.
Mhm. Yeah,
Matthew,
and I'll say that this is why I love uh Dr. Madden's work because he talks about this idea of the hyperobject, right?
mhm,
And what is it?
yeah,
And I don't know, maybe he could get into that a little bit.
sure.
And then we'll talk about it.
Can I ask you a question first, though, Matthew?
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
don't think that the questions have to come from me. If you want
Cool.
to say something, jump in, either one of you, please.
So
Okay.
one, I think in the book you mentioned before your experience on ship that you had been doing some psychological work that you thought had prepared you in a way that some of your colleagues were not prepared, and that had repercussions down the road for the further experiences. Am I understanding you right on that?
Yes, exactly. Precisely.
Would you mind it much like were you already kind of doing some shadow work kind of thing? Were you did you have you had your stuff analyzed at that point or?
Yeah, so this is the thing. Being in the Navy, and this is why I think people in the military are prime for this experience, right? Because you go out to sea, right? And other people out there are projecting, right? They're projecting all of their stuff on everything and everyone around them. But then you go out to sea, you're deployed, and there's nothing to project anymore, right? Like where are you where are you going to project that? your family's not there, your friends aren't there, uh, your spouse isn't there. There's nobody to blame. Your classic car isn't there, so you don't have you suddenly these projections, you have to become those things because those things are not there anymore.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I was doing that. Like and I thought it was just like something that I was doing because it was just easier for me to deal with, right? Because then it wouldn't hurt so much when I'm pulling away from the pier and I'm not going to be back for a year. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? It wouldn't be so devastating to me to think of that. Like, I would have colleagues that, would pull into port and they're like, "Oh, I can't wait to get off the ship," and they'd stand down there in the hangar bay and they're in this line a mile long. And I'm just like, well, I don't want to deal with any of that. I'm going to go take a nap and I'll leave at some point this evening. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
That's,
Because it just didn't matter to me whether or not I was at work or at home. It was all the same to me,
yeah.
but people have this psychological idea that those two things are different and that you have to hate one and love the other,
Yeah.
right?
And so I mean, so there's nothing's going to get you into your shadow and find your projective weaknesses like being at sea, right?
Oh
Because
yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
it's like a constant meditation retreat you're on for yeah. One more thing, if you don't mind, I'd like to bring up, and this is one of the things in reading your book, I had a hard time connecting. It's not a flaw of the book, it's more my being dense. Okay.
Mhm,
Okay, so you have on ship, you have a very nuts and bolts thing that happens, to use that word. Yeah. So
mhm,
you literally see a video of, you hear rumor of what's going on, and you see a video of some sort of this object. I don't like to say craft because I don't think we know it's a craft. It's an
mhm,
object. Okay, and then you have these other experiences that come on through dream state, sleep paralysis coupled with experiences. And when I say in sleep paralysis, that's not a dismissal. There's going to be a
mhm.
physical for any experience, right? Okay, so looking at it now, and I couldn't quite get this in the book. Like, what do you do with the nuts and bolts story about this? I mean, do you think we are dealing with literal physical technological objects, or is that us projecting our expectations on things and looking at these, and it's partly because it is mostly mediated to us through the military, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a great
Right.
question. I would also add that I think more happened though, right? Like there's more we don't know about in your story that you haven't yet told. Is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
And I'm not,
Yeah.
I'm not, I'm not fishing for anything like
I
that, but
am. Whatever you feel comfortable sharing in a good
I,
way. I mean, not in a
yeah,
bad way, but
Yeah, I think you're right though. And this is goes back to your idea of a hyperobject, right? Like, so you have these things that um there's really no explanation for. So it's kind of a blank slate for people to project whatever they want to on it. You know what I mean? And so if you want to project that this is some kind of this is Satan, right? This is the devil. You can project that. Um, if you want to say that these are angels, you can project that. I mean, it's just whatever you want to project. It's a blank slate for you to project against. But I will say that when people ask me what are they, what are these craft or whatever, I what I do with that is I do think it is a nuts and bolts phenomenon, clearly, because you have radar, it's picked up on radar signatures. You're not gonna you're not gonna be able to lock on from an aircraft to an object that isn't there, right? So there's something there, something physical is there. Um, well, I is it a craft? I don't know. I don't think that some of these questions, I feel like, people think that they're the most important questions to get answered. And I'm okay with uncertainty,
yeah.
right? I don't need things to be so certain. Um, and I'm not bothered by that. But you know, my whole thing is, so I had this profound experience, and I talk about in my book, if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, there's a guy on the corner, he has $1 million for you if you just go up and ask him for it," you know, and then you grab this person by the collar and you shake him and you say, "Well, I need to know what kind of car he's driving. You know, is it electric or is it gas?" You know, and it's like, well, does that really matter? I I don't know, you know, and so that's kind of my answer to that question.
But we don't all have the benefit of the direct experience of it. You know what I mean? Like for some folks, they are seeking to find the most tangible thing that will prove to themselves and the rest of the world the reality of the situation, because then it will, explain, give them some justification for how they've been thinking and all of that. But you've had it, you know, as closely confirmed as it can possibly be due to your personal experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If I could riff on that a little bit, yeah, as you know, like you've read some of my stuff. I'm with you 100%. 100% is that we have this sort of Goldilocks ontology that we're evolved to think of things in. And when in doubt, we will pull. It's a prediction of what we walk around with a prediction in our heads of what we're going to find. And so most of our experience is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the cognitive science on this is very good. Okay, there's a predictive model of mind that's like one of the emerging views of cognition in cognitive science. And so we walk around predicting what we're going to find based on prior experiences and what we're evolved to find. And then when in doubt, we will maintain that prediction at all costs, meaning we will lie to ourselves or we'll disfigure things. And I think once we know this about ourselves, when we get across truly anomalous stuff, like what you encountered and what other experiences are encountered, we should mistrust our going interpretations of what it is. And in fact, right, I mean, we should assume that mostly in our interpretation, it's a projection from us onto it. Okay. And that's just because it's not a character thing. That's just how human minds work. And I think if there's a value to this, it's our learning to be told by something else what it is, to get over our own self-fulfilling prophecies and things like that. And that was one of the things I really liked about your book is you don't really put your foot down and say, here's what it is. And I think that's, we have to guard ourselves against that temptation to do that, because I think that's to miss the very message of the thing, which is humility. Like, man is not the measure after all.
Yeah, and also to say, you know, that it is transformative if you allow it to be.
Yes.
But in order for something to be transformative, it doesn't have to be completely defined, you know. It can be something abstract.
Yep. And so if I could, you had asked about the hyperobject, or you brought up the hyperobject issue. Okay, so for what I'm getting at in the hyperobject business, and I won't rehearse all of it because listeners of this podcast have heard me talk about it before. Okay, but
Yes, and I recommend it. People can watch it, find it on my playlist.
the point is human beings, if you think of it, we came online, as it were, as hunter-gatherers. Okay, so we're basically set up to think of a time scale of like between now and our next meal. We've got about we're like made to think about 12 hours ahead. So then you go out, you pick the berries for the day, and then you play. Okay, we're not really long-term thinkers, and we're evolved to think about a spatial scale, about as far as we could walk on an afternoon. Okay, but now we've put ourselves in this situation where, like, just think of like just using food as an example. Like our global food network operates on vast, transcontinental, scales, on through courses of time that we can barely fathom, right? And so we're constantly now, we've put ourselves in situations where we're stepping into time scales and spatial scales that we weren't evolved to deal with. Okay. And things are getting out of hand. Like I don't think we really understand our own economies anymore. I don't think we really understand our own politics anymore. Okay. But I think this is really, all of that is to remind us that there's a vast scale of reality that is just beyond the human ken, right? That maybe we just get at the very edges. And maybe it's always been that way, that, just because there's a certain way we frame things that's convenient to our sort of hunter-gatherer past, right? That doesn't mean that's actually the measure of what there is. Okay. And this notion of a hyperobject is that there probably are things that operate on scales of time and space that outstrip what human beings are even set up to deal with. And maybe we catch them at their edges, just the very edge of these things. We get a little hint of what they are, and that's going to freak us out. Okay. But those things, as you I think really point out well, Matthew, have a broader perspective that because they operate these scales, they're going to know things we don't. And if we could tame ourselves, right, from our too quick interpretations of them, maybe we could listen to what these grand scale things have to tell us, right? But I think we're missing that opportunity in many, many ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and I heard you talking about this with Kelly from the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast, where you guys were talking about these objects, and you say, well, what is it? Like, what is the thing at its core, this hyper object? And I think that it's impossible to know that as long as you are doing these psychological projections. Because what you will see is a reflection of yourself or some aspect of yourself. You won't actually know what that thing is at its core, because you're just looking in a mirror, is what you're doing. And so that I think people really underestimate the importance of the ability to do that. I was very careful when I was going through my experiences that if I didn't understand something, I wouldn't put it in this basket of, oh, well, let me just hop to some kind of conclusion about that and say it's this, right? I said, well, I don't really understand that right now. Maybe I will at some point. I know that it happened, but I'll just put it on the back burner and we'll see where it goes. You know what I mean? And so I think that's what people really need to get into the habit of doing, is identifying where they're projecting themselves and stopping that. Because I will say, you talk about how we don't understand our economy and things like that. I think that is why economies fail, because we don't understand that we're projecting, right? And so if you have enough people that are projecting something very destructive onto either an economy or onto a governmental system, that's how those things begin to break down.
Yeah.
I think that that's exactly what's been going on with our political system when you have the left and right projecting their ideas onto each other. And that whole notion, I mean, if we stopped projecting our own issues onto everything and anyone we encounter, that the whole world would be a radically different place. And it seems to me like what you're saying is doubly fascinating, because if all these contacts that we're having are intending to strip us of that, projective habit, that sort of explains the mystery. It's like it's trying to get us to where it tilt, like a machine, like we have a moment where everything goes haywire so that we can reboot and realize that what's out there doesn't have to be what's in here, but we have no other way right now to manipulate it mentally,
Yeah, and I think what the phenomenon did for me actually was that I was already doing this psychological work, but you have to take that work to an extreme, right? That we like, just like Dr. Madden was talking about, how you have the edges of this thing that doesn't really lie within our reality.
Yeah.
And so when you take it to that extreme, you can then start to experience those edges, right? For yourself. And that is a very profound thing. But as human beings, unless we're put into these types of situations, we would see no reason to take our own psychology to such an extreme. There would be no benefit that we could see for it. And so that's why there's the need for this kind of interchange and interaction between ourselves and the phenomenon, so that we can expand that perspective and that perception of what is real.
Hey, James, how does it strike you that so much of this is like reflected in what we've been hearing from like the perennial philosophy for thousands of years, that like if you want the answer to what the universe is about, look within, as above, so below? That whole notion seems to be getting more and more confirmed. But like in academic circles, or I mean, not to be general about it, but like for a lot of folks, that's just all hogwash, vaguely pagan kind of ruminations that have no bearing on reality. But everything that we're hearing is like basically going back to the Kabbalion and other sources like that, where it's like all of that sort of vaguely Gnostic or Hermetic stuff seems to be more and more resonant with truth. Um, how is that going to affect academia when, if that bears out and we're looking at where we're at and where we really are and where we thought we were, and we find the truths are in so much of the discard piles? How does that help or hurt our self-conception? I mean, do we begin to I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's bad news for conventional academia, and I think all the better. Okay, so because it's interesting if you were to go to a typical American research university and work to get a PhD in philosophy, like literally this is the phrase that'll be used now, is you will be taught how to make academic productions. Okay. And like creating papers that can be published in journals that will thereby get you tenure, that then maybe will be read by other people so they can write papers about your papers and thereby get tenure in this sort of like strange vicious circle. Okay. And even in philosophy, like the one thing you're not supposed to talk about is like the meaning of life. Okay.
Which is funny. I mean,
you can publish papers about what Plato says the meaning of life is, but it has to be that second order. I'm just interpreting a text. Okay. Mm-hmm. Or you can publish papers about so-and-so's argument for God's existence, and you can say it's a good or a bad argument, but like you're not really ever putting your foot down as like, this is who I am or something like that. It's all to be left out. And you're trained this way. And there's good reasons for this. Like you can't be about you. Okay. But so basically what you have is like what in academia, even in philosophy, even though I think philosophy is more open-minded than most academic disciplines, your writing, your teaching, all of that is oriented toward what are the interests of like the student loan industrial complex that is like the contemporary university. And it doesn't lend itself to really it's not about enlightenment. Okay, it really is not. Okay, it might be about critical thinking or something like that, but it's not about enlightenment. Right. And this is one of the things I love about getting now involved with this issue. Okay, because now, whereas like I'm gonna see Matthew Roberts as my peer now. Okay, even though he's outside the academy. Okay, because he's had experiences, he's read this material. Do you know what I mean? And he's thinking about this in the fundamentally important way that is, what does this tell us about our existence, and not just as a scholarly exercise. Okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
And increasingly, because of people like Matthew, and I'm fanboying you, Matthew, but I work with a lot of people. Okay, because of people like Matthew, there is now increasingly a conversation in the popular culture about fundamental matters, right? And about the meaning of life, and about what the hell is the point of us being here, and what would be lost if we ruin this thing, and all that, which isn't really happening in academia. Okay. And so I think, hey, if my profession has fallen asleep at the switch, then James Falk, you go fill in, right? Mm-hmm. Matthew Roberts, you go fill in, and I will help you guys any way I can. Because I do feel like my profession has fallen asleep at the switch, right? And I've been lucky because I teach at a very, very serious Catholic school. Okay. So because of the religious commitment of the school, the academic program isn't just about like the academic production. We're supposed to be engaging these young people with fundamental issues. Now there's other issues with orthodoxy and stuff like that, but you can see why like I'm kind of spoiled that I can go in there and talk about real things. That's not like that in most of academia. Okay. Yeah. And so I like the idea that the UAP is turning philosophy into like the Wild West, right? And it's getting it outside of the control system of academia. So I say, guys, bring it on, and I will be happy to help you any way I can.
Yeah, it's fresh blood, right? I mean, it's like energy and all of that, vitality that's a part of the conversations that have long been ignored. And I think it goes back to your talk earlier about the difference between academic philosophy and then just philosophizing, which a lot of people feel emboldened to do, but maybe that's something we should be taking a little bit more seriously.
Look, I'm sorry, I don't mean to embarrass you, but using Initiate as an example, there's books I'm reading now that I had not read before because of what Matthew's citing in his book. I mean, he's
Yeah.
moving me around. Yeah.
Well, and that's the other rabbit hole that happens here is that you go from book to book to book and they all have references and you begin to, it's like it's really a never-ending cycle, but in a good way. So, I mean, out of all your experiences, Matthew, one thing I wanted to ask you about is that I'd had several interviews with folks and they were talking about contact modalities and the idea that um, all the various paranormal things that we encounter in human life, whether it's NDEs or out of body experiences or alien or UFO encounters or any number of things, big feet, everything else, that they're all sort of an encounter with one particular thing, one particular realm. And I was wanting to get your opinion about that. I mean, do you think that you know, an NDE is the same thing as a UFO encounter, or do you think that they are different species of experiences?
Well, I think that all of these things, like Dr. Madden pointed out, all of those things are kind of at the edges of reality for
Yeah.
us, right? Or they're fringe. And so when you begin to experience those things, you may experience some aspect of it. And for me, I started to experience some aspect of it, but I did what probably most people don't do, right? I said, okay, I want more. I want to know more, and I want to take this all the way to whatever uh invisible end there is to this. And most people, when they begin to experience this kind of stuff, they don't do that. They will say, "Oh no, this does not fit my perception of reality. I'm not going down that road. I'm not going to go crazy. I'm not going to be viewed as crazy." And so there's a certain amount of bravery that goes along with that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, and so, I would encourage people to think about these things and to kind of dive into them and to not be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of the unknown. As you guys were talking about earlier, you come to realize that there really is magic in the world, and it's not just this dead thing, and that human evolution is not just some kind of dead, evolutionary biology that you can boil everything down to. There's experience, there's life, there's wonder, and it's really, if this had not happened to me, I don't know what my life would look like. It would probably be very empty, and shallow, is the only way I could describe it. As a result of having gone through this, I can say that my life is so much more rich for it. Um, and I think you guys would both agree. Like I read books that, uh, 10 years ago, I would have thrown in a trash can, before I read it. But now I'm reading these books and I'm like, yeah, I can see how this fits.
Yeah. Are you aware of any effort underway to collect experiencer stories with or without identities associated and to try and get sort of a meta-analysis of what the collective messages might well be or mean? I'm especially intrigued with, your statement earlier that it may well be that people in government are having these contacts more often than other folks. I'm wondering if there is a way that we've been able to sort of collect those messages and get a sense of overall mission or purpose, or if you've heard of anything like that, have you been asked to share your story in that kind of a way? And do you think that would be useful? And I'd like both of you to
I
answer that if you could.
I think it would definitely be useful, 100%. But I don't know of any organization that is actively collecting that kind of thing right now. Uh,
Yeah.
if someone wanted to undertake that mission, I think it would be worthwhile. Because when you start collecting these stories, you'll start to see common threads and themes, right? That kind of run through all of it. And that was something that I noticed. looking back on my own experience and then reading other experiencers' experiences and seeing that they experienced some of these same things, but they didn't get as much out of it as I did, because maybe I could see in how they're telling their story that maybe they were projecting something something else onto it that wasn't really there. I don't know. I don't know, but it would be a worthwhile thing
Yeah, it's
for
almost
sure.
like how they used to collect folklore stories, or like when the slave population started dying off, they wanted to collect the information from slaves who were aging. I mean, a way to preserve that folklore. And I think that if we did that and subjected it to some data analysis, there might be some insights. James, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely really important, and I think this is one of the things that maybe academics can help with, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't mean, I hate to do like an advertisement, but I recently put an essay out on my Substack. It was a reaction piece to Kastrup's article he published on the UAP.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I think the first time he talked about that was on your show, so that's cool.
Yeah, I was lucky in that way. He's a great guy.
And one of the points I make, and I'm very supportive of Bernardo's view of it, maybe a bit different from mine, but I'm very supportive of what he's up to. But there's an example that at one time classical scholars thought Homer didn't exist, right? Because they figured it was impossible for anybody to have written a poem of the length of the Iliad from memory. Because I mean, not just memorizing, but imagine editing something of that length consistently from memory. Okay, it would seem impossible to do that. Okay, so it was assumed that there really was no one person named Homer, that this was he himself was a mythological character of this oral tradition that was passed down. Okay. And then it was discovered that there, in fact, are, pre-literate societies that, at least in the 19th century, were still pre-literate, there were people that had memorized and edited even longer poems than the Iliad. So then suddenly it got to the point where you couldn't rule out that Homer existed. Okay. So it then made sense to inspect the poem to see if it had the internal characteristics of a single author. Now, it didn't pay to do that if you thought it was impossible for there to have been a single author. But if it's plausible, even if not probable, that there's a single author, you might look at the poem. And if the poem shows the mark of having been written by a single person, it then seems very likely that Homer does exist and he's trying to tell you something. You see that? Okay. Well, some philosophers of religion, a fellow named Thomas Sullivan and a woman named Sandra Menson, wrote a book called The Agnostic Inquirer, where they used that argument as a style for talking about God's existence. So they said, look, even if you don't have overwhelmingly good evidence that God exists, if it's just plausible enough that you can't rule out God's existence, then it would make sense to look at what claim to be revelations from God in the religious traditions to see if it says anything that would wow, that does sound like it's coming to me from God. And then that would then up the probability that God exists, that God had written the poem. Do you see the method there?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think something like this could be done with the phenomenon. Okay,
Yeah.
so the experience, I think there's enough experiencers now that for even those of us on the outside, at worst, we have to say we can't rule out that there is something going on here. Okay. But let's suppose I am fairly well convinced of this, but let's say you weren't. Okay, but you can't rule it out. Well, if you can't rule it out, it pays to look now at what is being claimed is the message of these entities, and ask yourself, is that what we would expect to hear from something beyond the human? Does it have some kind of marks like that? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And if we make that move methodologically, I think there's a couple of tasks here. Like one, we've got to collect all the claims. Okay. They have to be analyzed. Okay. And they have to be analyzed in two ways. Like they have to analyze first, what is just the human contribution to this? What is our own projection as a species here, and also of the individuals? So there's going to be an anthropological role there. There's going to be a psychological role there. Okay. But then also we have to start asking ourselves, what would be the mark of something beyond us trying to talk to us that we might be able to find in this? Okay. So long answer, but I think what you're suggesting there, I think is what should be the primary research program for people involved in UAP studies.
Yeah. I think that that's sounds amazing. And if you start adding in analytical tools like the upcoming development of AI and whatnot, who knows what conclusions can be drawn from that kind of information. Yeah,
And
go ahead.
I'll say I'm serious enough about this that I'm looking at getting trained in psychoanalysis to be able to contribute to this. Yeah. So
Yeah, no, that's great, man. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about it when you get closer to it or whatever else. And I think that that's a great, I mean, if we can have a sort of way to help experiencers grok what's happening to them, or at least affirm them in their experience by saying, I'm not going to pass judgment on whether or not these things actually happened, but I accept that you've had these experiences, and here's things that you can do to like be affirmed in that, which is tell your story, have it recorded, have it be a part of this greater thing that contributes to the answering of this fundamental human question. And I think that that would be better than just ignoring folks or acting like they're crazy, which I think is where we're at currently. Matthew, do you have any idea on that?
Yeah, I mean, that was exactly why I wrote my book,
Yeah.
because I wanted people to have something that they could hold in their hands, and when someone says, you're nuts, and then they could take this book and say, look, this guy worked at the Office of Naval Intelligence, had a top secret security clearance for 16 years. He's saying this stuff is real, and it happened to him too.
but
Um,
because this is a point I really want to emphasize. Okay.
yeah.
I think people miss this. Okay. Now certainly people can have psychological problems. People can lose their minds, and I don't say that flippantly, right? But like people who did the kind of work that you did go through a
Yeah.
lot of okay, and your psychological health is watched very closely. You see what I'm saying? And so I think the fact that like the least likely people to have completely lost touch with reality, right, are people in the kind of work that you did. Do you see my point? And I just want to emphasize that because when you're talking about jet pilots, you're talking about cryptologists, you're talking about people with clearances, like they have gone through a lot of psychological scrutiny, and it's ongoing. You're checked on quite a bit. It's just it seems to me the segment of the population least likely to be operating under a psychotic break that's gone under the radar.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I had a discussion with a unnamed politician, high ranking, and I won't put his name out there, but I was basically advocating for the issue and saying, well, I think you should take it seriously because there's this, this, and this. And I listed all the things that had been in the headlines and everything else. And he looked at me, and basically at one point I said, these are coming from people who are highly trained witnesses. There are fighter pilots. They're like the cream of the crop. And he's of liberal bent, which I've always considered myself to be of the same. But like this pall came over his face, and it was like he immediately associated anything like military with the right wing, which linked it to Trump and linked it to like QAnon. And so immediately he just dismissed anything having to do with it. And there was this elitism air about it, which was really off-putting to me and actually made me really angry. But it's to some extent, I mean, we have all these fissures in our society, and and how they play out in regards to this phenomenon is going to be determine a lot about how it goes forward. But there's a whole side of the political spectrum right now who is going to judge it by virtue of their beliefs that the right has gone crazy, and I find that really unfortunate, especially when some of the people who are advocating most for transparency are themselves on the right, and sometimes prone to beliefs that I'm not necessarily calling the most cogent or coherent. But when they're advocating for this issue, I'm like, yeah, you know what I mean? But it just goes to the difficulty of some of this, and like how previously existing issues in our society or within our heads complicate it because we're projecting.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think that this issue has really drawn kind of a stark line, in terms of division in this country, because you can see how people who consider themselves liberal and more educated are less likely
Yes.
to take this seriously. And I guess that all of this is just psychological projection, of course,
Of course. Yeah.
on both sides. Um, and that's why I feel like people like Dr. Pasulka, Dr. Madden here, Jeffrey Kripal, all of the all of you guys are so brave for what you have done. Because it's not something that academia takes seriously, and so my hat is off to you guys because you guys are really just you're on the cutting edge of this, right? And you're really in a place that matters going forward. Even though even if people dismiss you today, people in the future are going to look back and say, "Wow, those guys, they were the real pioneers here."
At least we gave it a shot, right?
What's that?
You gave it a shot.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and especially if you go on to develop programs for higher degrees in the subject,
Maybe, yeah. So Matthew, may I ask you maybe a little more personal question?
Sure.
Sure. So, I'll start with my end of this. So I went to the Inquire Anomalous conference in New York last December. Okay. And that was the first time I had really stepped in person into the world of people who are experiencers. Okay. And it really struck me. It's one thing to say, yeah, on paper, I think the evidence is good enough. The probabilities are fairly high. There's something to this. Another thing to like meet someone who's like, no, I saw this. This happened to me. And like this person is like a concrete flesh and blood human being in front of you, and they're clearly bright and they're not raving. It was a very powerful experience to me. And then to meet like dozens of people like that just in a few days. Okay. And I remember getting home thinking, okay, what do I do now? Like, what does my daily life look like?
Yeah.
That's a second order relationship to the experience. Do you see what I mean? It's just like, I'm at like the point of where I've met people who have had this happen to them. And that's already blowing me away in ways. Okay. I just want to ask you, Matthew, is okay. So you have these experiences and you work your way through it. Okay. And you come to these conclusions. And then now you get out of bed in the morning and what do you do? Like, what do you do?
Yeah.
You're like, you're out of the cave now, and this whole reality that's around you in the humdrum world isn't the real deal. What do you do?
Yeah. How are you transformed? That's a good question.
Well, I mean, I think that I only do I do what I can do, right? I go on podcasts and I talk about this stuff and I answer questions as honestly as I can. And I like I'm continuing to write. I'm writing this other book. And so that's what it's gonna be. I mean, and it is very difficult because you really want to just get everyone there, right, to a point where they could take this seriously. But unfortunately, this may not be that time. I don't really know. And so you can only do what you can do, and you have to be okay with that. Um, and it's something I heard Jeffrey Kripal talk about this. He said something to the effect that he can write these books and he can talk about this stuff and that stuff will live on, right? Like he doesn't even have to be alive anymore, and people can still draw from that, you know. Look, I mean, look at Plato. We're still talking about him thousands
Homer.
of years later. Yeah,
Homer.
exactly.
Yeah.
So,
I
so
think
what's that? I'm sorry.
books are hyperobjects. Like you introduce them into the environment and they take on a life of their own that is far beyond you, right? My books are no longer in my control. They're out there and people will read them and they will take from them things I haven't fathomed. Your book is probably the same way. It's out there. People are going to read it and take things you can't. And it's not even yours anymore, right? It's just out there, right? And it will outlive you. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that's interesting about that I thought a lot about is that all the meaning that you put in your book with your intention as you were writing it, it changes the minute it encounters a reader who has his own set of subjective facts, and the meaning that they draw from it and the work that arises out of it can have little or nothing to do with what you originally intended. And it's sort of this kind of a magical communion. But what were you going to say, Matthew?
Oh, I was just going to ask Dr. Madden, like you've gone through this journey in that, this wasn't something that you necessarily took seriously, or you believed in before, but now you do. And so how do you deal with that on a daily basis? How do you apply that to what you're doing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It has changed the focus of my reading, writing, thinking, and teaching. I mean, I teach differently. There's different content I'm teaching now. I mentioned like I'm getting trained in psychoanalytic theory because I think I need those tools to go forward, to think about this and to write about it. I mean, it's it's become one of the main, if not the main, focuses of what I'm doing professionally. And I'll admit it's in my personal life. I mean, my wife and I talk about it pretty constantly, right?
Yeah, I hear that.
My kids, yeah, and my kids they've grown up, listening, to the podcast that I'm listening to, and hearing me talk about these ideas with my wife, and so I think it has affected things deeply, and because I think of myself as an educator, because I think of myself as a philosopher, if this is where the most important aspect of reality is, that for whatever weird reason I'm gifted to think about, then I'm gonna run with it and see what I can do with it. And so yeah, in a similar way, I think the way you think about it, Matthew, is I'm just going to do my best to develop ideas and put them out. And if they turn out to help, then they turn out to help. And if they don't, at least I can maybe show some dead ends.
I mean, don't want to equate anything I'm doing with what you guys are doing, but that's exactly what my experience has been as well. I mean, I'm a small town journalist, but I spend a lot of my time right now covering UAPs for a podcast that luckily I've convinced my place of work to allow me to do and sponsor it and all that stuff. But it's like trying to figure out how to have the conversation and engage people with it while not also overwhelming them or yeah, I don't know. It's wonder has returned to my life, and I love that aspect of it. And I hope to instill it a little bit in my kids, but I can't stop them from rolling their eyes. They seem to have a quirk now. Whenever I open my mouth and start talking about UFOs, their eyes like wander off and they lose their focus. Well, that's pretty much
Yeah.
all I had for you guys. Is there anything else you wanted to throw in there, or what were you going to say, Matthew, again?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say that don't sell yourself short. I mean, this podcast is really one of the best on this topic. I will say that this is one of the few podcasts that I watch every episode.
Well, I
Um,
appreciate that, man. I really do,
yeah, you
actually.
have guests on that are just totally 100% relevant, and they've got good things to say, and there's a lot of good thinking that goes on this podcast. So don't sell yourself short. I think it's a great thing.
Well,
It
thank
really
you.
is.
And I appreciate both of you guys coming back on. That makes me
No,
feel.
I agree too, James. I remember that when you invited me to be on, I went and checked out your YouTube. I was like, man, this guy is getting everybody really interested in this field. And
Yeah.
I don't know how you've done it. And so, yeah, excellent. And I like that once again, you just had an interview with Michael Zimmerman, which you're bringing people that are very important that some probably haven't been heard of.
Yeah.
And it's important. Yeah.
And they have insights. I mean, Michael Zimmerman was a great conversation. I'm hoping to get Jeff Kripal in April, which I've had once before, but it was before I really knew what I was doing. Before I had been handed my mission, I guess, by the phenomenon in some way. I do want to add one more thing before I go, and I want to kind of close with this. Last time I had you on, Matthew, we had a great conversation. It was one of the best conversations I've had on the show. So thank you for that. And I had an experience afterwards. And I think it was directly had to do with our conversation. I don't know. I can't quantify it, define it, whatever else, but I saw something like light plasma as I was meditating, and it shook me in a lot of ways, but it affirmed that I think I'm on the right path. But there was like synchronicities and a lot of things that happened, and that felt weird those couple days. And then I was meditating, I think the night after or the night after that, and saw something, and I was like, Matthew infected me. He gave it to me through the someone was just talking the other day about it's not so much what you do or how you are that gets you into the phenomenon, it's who you know, and that it can be passed from person to person. So I don't know if that's true or not, but you inspired me. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad I was able to help someone.
Yeah, somehow through
Yeah.
the ether. All right, guys. Well, I appreciate your time and thank you again. And I hope to have you guys back on the show at some point, ongoing conversations, and I look forward to it all. So thank you guys.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Madden.